Chapter 9. Who Are We, Really? I shut the door behind me and walked over to Elizabeth. "What do you think?" I asked. "He's interesting," she said. I could see from the light in her eyes something I hadn't seen in a long while, that hope had returned. "Do you think he's for real?" I asked carefully. "I don't know for sure. Something about him is very convincing," she said. "A scripture about Jesus comes to my mind," I said, clearing it off the table. It says, "He taught as one having authority, not as one of the scribes." John seems to teach with an authority or knowledge behind what he says, unlike any teacher I have ever heard. "It goes beyond that," added Elizabeth. "I definitely felt something when he touched me. I swear, I think I can stand up." She nudged forward in her chair. "Take my hand," she commanded. "You aren't going to try to get up, are you?" I said, walking toward her. "I feel like I can stand. Pull me up," she insisted. "I don't know," I said, giving her a fairly limp hand. She grabbed and pulled. Her pull made me pull back until she was standing upright. "I don't believe it," I exclaimed. "You haven't stood in months." "I think I can walk," she exclaimed as she took a step. Then she took another, letting go of my hand. Next she walked slowly across the room and rested against the wall. She radiated like an Olympic winner at the finish line. "It's a miracle," I shouted. "John said I would have increased strength for a couple days," Elizabeth cautioned, walking back and forth slowly across the room. "Since this is temporary, I think we should go for a walk while I have the strength." "Do you think you can?" "There's one way to find out," she said. "Get our coats and let's breathe some fresh air." Sometimes there was no way of saying no to Elizabeth. I had to at least humor her. I got the coats. "Why are you so determined to take a walk?" I asked. There was something in John's voice as he was leaving. Remember what he said? Something like, "Walking helps you to arrange your thoughts." He said something about putting my thoughts and fears in the right place so they would no longer be destructive. Then Elizabeth took my arm and walked out the door and down the steps with a strength and determination that amazed me. Soon we were walking down the street at a brisker pace than I had thought possible. "Let's head toward the foothills where we used to go," she suggested in a childlike voice. I couldn't discourage her at this point. We lived only a few blocks from some beautiful foothills that we hadn't been able to explore since the illness. We headed toward them, and to my pleasant surprise, Elizabeth seemed to have the strength to continue. "It's so good to be able to walk again," she breathed in deeply. "I've never felt so good in my life. Even the air feels like it is charged with life." "Just think of all the walks we could have taken together but didn't," I said. "You know, I never thought of it before, but I can see how walks can take your mind off your troubles. Just look at the beauty of this place. How can a person be fearful or worrisome while walking through them?" "I think I can see how John was right," said Elizabeth. "For several years before my illness, and perhaps even more after my illness, I've had my attention on my problems and my fears. Even when I seemed to be taking it easy, my concerns were still there gnawing at me. If my brain has needed a rest, I can see how I didn't get it. On the other hand, it seems as if your brain doesn't get any rest either." "You can't always tell what's going on inside by looking or even living with someone," I replied. "I think I'm successful at keeping unwanted fears and thoughts from affecting me continuously. Even when I have little time or am under a lot of pressure, I set aside periods of time where my undesirable thoughts and fears are diverted. They're not suppressed, but sort of like in hibernation." Then it was like a light was turned on in my head. "Perhaps it would be more accurate to say," I said, "it's like I've created a place for them and have put them there. That's kind of the way John put it, isn't it?" "Yes," she nodded. "He said something about sending our thoughts and fears to the right place. That's a little the way I feel now, like my unwanted thoughts and fears are in storage, beyond some locked door somewhere. Right now, while we are walking through these beautiful hills, they have no power over me. This is the first time since my illness that I can remember feeling this way." "Maybe this means that you're healed," I said hopefully. It was too good to be true, I thought, but miracles do happen. "I don't know. John said that I would have added strength for a few days," she said. "It's like some other will besides my own is keeping those symbolic doors locked and making me safe for a period of time. He said I could be healed if we solved the first 3 keys. Maybe we should take this quiz program of his seriously. You said something about the importance of getting the question right. Tell me the exact wording again. We sat down on some rocks to rest. It was not just who am I said, but who or what am I? And what answers did you give him that he said were not correct? He didn't quite say they were not correct, I replied, but implied that my answers didn't mean anything. Apparently there was some core answer I'm supposed to come up with. Tell me the answers you gave him that were not it. First I said I was a human being. Well, when I look at your office, I sometimes wonder about that, she smiled. You are feeling better, aren't you? I quipped. What else did you say? I said a spirit, a soul, a son of God. None of these were it. Well, you would think that our essence would be some type of spirit or spiritual. Why did he say this was not it? He said, saying I am spirit does not mean anything. He asked me to define spirit, and I couldn't say anything intelligent. So he wants you to say something definite about who you are, and if you do not know what spirit is, it means nothing to say you are spirit, she replied. I think it's something like that, I answered. Have you done any more thinking about who or what you are? Some. What have you come up with? Not much. How about you? Can you come up with anything, I ask? Well, I always find it's good just to rattle off whatever comes to mind and make a list and see if anything makes sense. I've pretty much rattled off my list, I said. Let's go through your list, perhaps from a woman's perspective. Smart man. Turn it over to a woman when you reach an impasse. Okay, let's see what you got, I said. Who or what am I? Let's see. Elizabeth stood up and we started walking again. In addition to what you've said, I could add that I am my thoughts, my feelings, my personality. I am what I look like. I am female. Did you know that many women define who they are by their home? That their home is an extension of themselves? I think you mentioned it to me. Your list sounds as good as mine, I said. Somehow, I don't think we have the answer, though. Let's write our thoughts down when we get home, and I'll present them to John in our next lesson. I guess that's about all we can do, she replied. There's one more thing I think I will do. What's that, she asked. I'm going to have breakfast with Wayne tomorrow. He's a good friend, been so for years, and an amateur philosopher. I think I will ask him the question. Elizabeth glanced at me anxiously. Didn't you say that John told you not to tell anyone about this yet? He told me not to tell anyone about him. He didn't put any restrictions on how I can come up with answers. Well, don't do anything to screw this up, she said, squeezing my arm. He said, if we master the first 3 principles, I will be healed. John said to listen to his exact words, and his exact words do not forbid me from tossing this by Wayne. We haven't done that great so far, she said. Maybe Wayne will give us an idea or two. The next morning I met Wayne at our favorite cafe. Wayne was an old friend about my age who had his own business. He ran a yard care business and did a little of everything for his customers, pruning, mowing, pest control, and so on. He looked like a regular homespun guy and usually wore a cowboy hat. You would never think by looking at him that he spent any time thinking about the meaning of life. But he loved to get together with me for breakfast at least once a week and just talk about philosophy, religion, the New Age, politics, meaning of life, or whatever. We both had respect for each other as 2 thinkers who looked a little deeper into the meaning of things than the average person. This morning I was hoping he would be at his philosophical best. How's your week been? I asked him as the waitress seated us. You don't want to know, he said, with a painful expression on his face. Even though Wayne was a great philosopher, he had not quite perfected the art of distilling his intelligence to the point of running his business smoothly. It seemed like every time we got together he had a horror story about some costly action one of his employees took. Several months ago, one ran off with about $10,000 worth of tools, just a couple days after Wayne bailed him out of jail. Just last week, one of them showed up on his doorstep with his wife and kids because they were evicted from their home. The reason? He spent his rent money on drugs. Wayne was beside himself on that one. Even though I felt bad that my good friend had so many business problems, I was always curious about what happened this time. I could never just let it slide. Okay, Wayne, tell me the story. He leaned back and sighed and said, I drew Skip a diagram. A map of the yard so there would be no mistake. Last time he told me I wasn't clear enough, so this time I drew him a damn map. Wayne almost spitted out the words. Wasn't Skip the one who pruned the wrong tree of some fussy customer, I asked? Yep. He promised it wouldn't happen again as long as I was clear with him. So I drew him a diagram of the yard with an X marking the spot where the birch tree was located. The instructions were simple. Take out the birch tree where X marks the spot. And he took out the tree from somewhere else, I guessed? Wayne shook his head and gritted his teeth. That stupid son of a bitch took out a birch tree on the east side of the lawn, not the west side where I had the X. So there were birch trees on both sides of the lawn, I said. Yes, but I had the X marked on the west side. If your diagram was not clearly marked, maybe he looked at it upside down and thought east was west. Good old Wayne doesn't get mad at me when I analyze his problems like Elizabeth does sometimes. That's what he claimed, said Wayne, but only an idiot would have read the map that way. I had the roses marked on the west side by the correct birch. That was just one of the ways he should have chosen the right tree. I thought to myself that I might have turned the map upside down if I'd been an employee myself, but my friend was aggravated enough without me adding fuel to the fire. So what's the owner going to do, I asked. We had to go back and take out the right tree for free and plant him 3 new trees, and he still isn't happy. He's talking about taking us to court, but I think he just wants to blackmail us for all he can get. The last time I talked to him, he said that if we mowed his lawn for free for the next year, he may not take legal action. I felt like telling him to take a hike, but I suppose we'll wind up mowing his lawn. That damn Skip. You think a guy could read a diagram? Maybe the next time you ought to actually show him the right tree in person, I offered gingerly. I don't have time to hold everyone's hand, Wayne said, shaking his head. Then at least you'd better mark east, west, north, south on your diagrams. Hell, that wouldn't do any good. Some of these guys don't know which way is up, let alone where west is. Wayne took a big gulp of water. This conversation seemed to end where it does each week. Wayne had a major problem with one of his guys, and there was no way to prevent it, and there was no way to prevent it from reoccurring. I was glad I was not asking him for business advice. Philosophy, yes. Wayne was as good as anyone I knew, but business did not seem to be his talent. Nevertheless, I did admire him for keeping at it despite all the setbacks. He did seem to be getting a little bit more savvy in the real world. I have a philosophical question for you, I said, changing the subject. Anything to get my mind off my guys, he said. I told you I didn't want to talk about my problems. Okay, here's the situation. I bent forward and asked in softer tones so as to not be overheard. Let's say that you have a vision and God appears to you. What does he or she look like? Wayne asked with a smirk. Doesn't matter. Just suppose God appears to you and offers you a deal. What kind of deal? Wayne seemed to be shifting his attention from his problems to his philosophical mode. I thought carefully. I couldn't tell him about John. Let's say that God tells you that if you can answer one simple question, he will give you 3 wishes. I could use 3 wishes. I would take a stab at it. Why not? What's the question? Here's the question, I said. Who or what are you? Now here's what the answer is not. It's not that you're a human being, a son of God, a spirit, or a soul. So if God says that none of these common answers are correct, what could it be? This is an odd line of questioning for you, Wayne said, looking at me suspiciously. Are you sure you didn't get hit on the head and see the big guy? No, nothing like that. I tried to sound nonchalant, but didn't know whether or not Wayne guessed something was up. Just been doing some thinking. I want your serious answer here. How would you answer the question? Okay, I'll play along. Not a son of God, not human, not spirit, not soul. Well, Jesus said something interesting about who we are that's in none of those categories. That might be helpful. What did he say? He said we are gods. That sounds like Mormon teachings. I've studied quite a bit about different religious teachings, and so has Wayne. Yes, the Mormons have a slant in that direction, he said, but in addition to them, there are billions of people on earth with some type of belief that man is a god of some sort. Most of the Christians believe this doctrine is heresy, however. But you're telling me that Jesus actually said it in the Bible? How does the actual wording go? Wayne took a sip of coffee and leaned forward. I remember clearly 3 words he said. It was, "Ye are gods." Jesus called us gods? I asked in hushed tones. I remember the Bible telling us that we're sons of God, but gods? Do you remember where the scripture is? I'm pretty sure it's in the Gospel of John, he said. John, I sputtered, spilling several drops of coffee on my lap. Careful there, Wayne grinned. Are you sure you didn't have some vision or something? You look pale. He looked carefully at my face. Here lately I'm not sure of anything, I said lamely. You really think Jesus said that in the book of John? Like I said, I'm pretty sure. John the Beloved himself recorded that. He was definitely the best New Testament author. Keep in mind that most Christians don't think he was seriously telling us we're gods. So what do you think? Do you think we're gods? Look at it this way, said Wayne. God is supposed to be everywhere, right? Well, that's what they say. You occupy some of that space they call everywhere, don't you? Well, yes. So, is God in the space you occupy? Well, if he's everywhere, then the answer would be yes. That means that God is in you. Yes again, I said. So would God be in your heart, brain, liver, or even your cells? Well, I guess they are all part of everywhere. If God is omnipresent, then I guess he would be in every atom of my body. I was catching on to Wayne's reasoning here. So if God is in every atom of your body, you are made of God. It follows then that you are God. If it's in you, through and through, then it's you. So do you think that it's true? Do you really think we're gods, I asked. Hell, I don't know, Wayne said, leaning back on his seat. I'm not even 100% sure that there is a God. Sometimes I'm not even sure I'm on the earth. Maybe everything is just a great dream, and when we wake up, there's nothing there. Or maybe when we wake up, we are in some place that makes sense. Better yet, maybe we'll wake up in a South Sea island full of beautiful girls to take care of our every need. Wayne grinned at this thought. Poor guy hadn't had a girlfriend in a long time. Very interesting thinking, but that scripture you mentioned interests me the most, I said. I'm going to look it up when I get home. I faintly remember reading it, but never thought of it in the context that we could actually be gods. Don't take it too seriously and expect me to worship you, Wayne smiled. I cut our conversation short and sped home and started researching the book of John. I finally found the scripture in chapter 10. Jesus answered them, Is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods? If he called them gods unto whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, say ye of him, whom the Father has sanctified and sent into the world, thou blasphemest, because I said I am the Son of God? After a little research, I realized that the law that Jesus mentioned was the book of Psalms. Jesus seemed to be saying that those who received the law of God or scriptures were called gods. Just maybe that was the answer. We are more than human, we are gods. I will admit, however, it seemed odd to think of myself as a god, but apparently the answer that John wanted was not just your standard Sunday school formula. I took the Bible in my hand and found Elizabeth in the family room. Sweetie, I think I may have the answer. She looked up. Don't tell me Wayne come up with something for you. Actually, he did. It's a bit off the wall, but it just may be what we're looking for. Okay, let me have it. We are gods, I exclaimed. I could hardly contain my excitement. She didn't look impressed. Wayne would come up with something like that, she said, looking back down at the book in her lap. Wayne didn't really think of it. Look here in the Bible. I moved toward her. Jesus said it. If Jesus said it, then that's got to be who we are. Let me read it for myself, Elizabeth said, taking the Bible out of my hands. She read the whole chapter. I remember this scripture, she said after a while. I was having an argument with a Mormon once, and he quoted this and told me that our destiny was to be gods. I was a little rattled and called the Bible Answer Man on the radio station. Oh, what did he say? I asked curiously. I didn't know she called radio stations about philosophical questions. He said we misread the scripture, that the original psalm was making fun of man because of his frailties. It was a little bit like one person putting down another by saying, You think you're hot stuff, don't you? The one guy doesn't really think the other is hot stuff, he's just making fun. So the scriptures explain away with the idea that God is making fun of us? That's basically what most people I've talked to seem to think, she said. Let me have that Bible again, I said. I carefully read over Psalms 82 and John chapter 10. I don't know. I read it over carefully, and I think Jesus was really saying that we are gods. Look, I said, kneeling beside her. He used the statement as a defense for saying that he was a son of God. In other words, if those who receive the law are gods, then why make a big deal out of the statement from Jesus that he was a son of God? Elizabeth looked up at me and smiled. You realize, don't you, that there is one way to find out? It dawned on me. Yes? Yes, I said, we can ask a man who knew Jesus personally. In fact, he's the man who wrote the scripture. I laughed. This was unreal. He should be working at his bell-ringing job right now, said Elizabeth. Why don't you go ask him? Chapter 10. The Dream. I drove over to Albertsons to seek out John again and ask him the 2,000-year-old question. I drove around the corner and saw the now familiar sight of the bell ringer. I parked, got out of the car, and headed toward him. John, I said. The bell ringer turned. It was not the same bells, nor was it the same John. Where's John? I asked. Who's John? Replied the man, a fairly scruffy-looking guy about 20 years younger than John. He's the guy who was working here before you. Oh, that guy. I'm not sure. He had to go out of town. When will he be back? I don't know. People come and go at this job. Chances are he'll never be back. Is there anyone who would know? You might check with the regional office. I went home and made several phone calls and finally found someone who remembered John. He had basically the same story. John was out of town for an indefinite period and wasn't sure when he would be back. He said he hoped John would come back soon because he was their best fundraiser. This was an event I never expected. Even though I had only known John a few days, it already seemed as if he was an old friend who would always be there when I needed him. It was almost as if he was a genie who belonged to me, as if he had not yet granted me my 3 wishes and had no right to take any time off until I had my way with him. Damn, I said to Elizabeth when I returned home. John is gone and I don't know when he'll be back. Do you know where he lives? You know, I never even thought to ask him. Who knows? Maybe he's just sitting in some small apartment in the North End watching TV and drinking a beer. John was certainly a man of many surprises. But didn't they say he was out of town? If he is a real apostle, I don't think he would lie. Well, maybe he hasn't left yet. Maybe if we knew where he lived, we could catch him before he left. Didn't he say he would give you more hints in a week? A week from your first encounter is next Thursday. If he is truly a man of his word, he will be back by then. That's 5 days away, I said. I wanted to talk to him today. I can't believe it. I feel more restless about seeing John again than I did about you when we fell in love. I never thought that could happen with another woman, let alone a man. My heart ached with disappointment. I realized I made a statement that may have hurt Elizabeth, and turned to her. I'm sorry. You know you're the most important person in my life. It's just that I felt such spiritual love and power coming from John. It seemed so familiar and so good, and now it's gone. I know, Elizabeth reassured me. I probably would be upset too, but I feel the same way. As soon as you said he was gone, I felt a void, and that extra strength that came through him is fading. I don't think I can get up again. I didn't want to see her get weak again. I grabbed her hand, hoping she could keep up her strength until she was healed. Here, let me pull you up. You must keep faith in yourself, that you can be well. I pulled on her, but she was unable to stand more than a few seconds. She was very shaky and unable to walk. I helped her back to her wheelchair. I noticed a tear falling down her cheek as she said, It was good to feel well for a day, but I'm losing strength fast. I think I'll soon be back to my normal weak self. John said that this short-term miracle was to give you faith that you can be healed. Even though it is passing, maybe we should be thankful that we had the opportunity to see that miracles are still possible. Perhaps, she said, but instead of faith I feel afraid. I'm afraid that we will never see John again. I don't know why. I feel kind of a sinking feeling. I have the same feeling, I agreed. For some reason, I feel a great void of energy. I hope nothing has happened to him. If anyone can take care of himself, I'm sure a 2,000-year-old man can, said Elizabeth. It's probably just us. We'll just have to live this next week with the belief that we will see him again no later than Thursday. You're right, said Elizabeth. We have to do everything possible to solve this first key. We need to at least show him that we've made the greatest possible effort. Yes, but I think we've done about all we can at this point. The best that I can come up with is that we must be gods like Jesus said in the Scripture. There's one other person you can call. Why don't you call your friend Lance in California and run by him the same question as you did Wayne? Yes, I thought that would be interesting to get Lance's input. We had a long history together. We were business partners for a while and shared many good times together. We also spent countless hours talking philosophy together. He moved to Los Angeles several years ago after he got thoroughly ingrained in the New Age movement. He has researched numerous groups and studied their philosophy. It's quite possible he has come up with some interesting interpretations to John's first key. That's a good idea, I said to Elizabeth. It wouldn't hurt to get his opinion. I don't think there's any New Age group that he hasn't looked into. Late that evening, I finally caught Lance in. How are things in the big city, I asked. Exciting things are happening, he said. Too bad you aren't here. I'm giving a seminar this weekend. You ought to come down and check out what I'm doing. Maybe after Elizabeth gets better, I said. How's she doing, he said. She's having her ups and downs, I replied. Give her my best, he said. Guess what my seminar is on? Well, knowing you, it could be anything. I call it Ye Are Gods, a synthesis of the New Age and the Bible. I almost dropped the phone. What made you pick that topic, I asked. Well, as you know, just about all New Agers down here think that man is some type of god who has forgotten who he is, that we just have to remember. Is that what you think? I asked hopefully. Yes, the idea is basically true, but what's interesting is that I've been running into these religious types lately who've been quoting the Bible at me right and left. They say the idea that man can become a god is Lucifer's first great lie. These guys really got under my skin, so I started studying the Bible again to see if it was as backwards as these guys make it sound. And guess what I found? I'm sure it's interesting, I quipped. Interesting? Listen. The Bible teaches out the yin-yang that humans are really gods. You mean like the Mormons teach? Well, not really. The Mormons are in kindergarten on this and seem to be embarrassed to talk about this doctrine anymore. The Bible doesn't tell us that we're going to be gods in some far-off future, but that we are gods in the here and now, very similar to many New Age teachings. The thing that gets me is that most New Agers think that anyone who believes in the Bible or studies it is back in the Stone Age, and Bible believers think that New Agers are worshippers of the devil himself. My studies reveal a harmony between the New Age philosophies and the Bible, and no one seems to see it. So I thought I'd get some lectures on the subject to see how much interest there is out there. So if someone asked you who or what we are, would you answer them that we are gods? Well, that's what Jesus said in the good book, he said. That's also what every teacher that's into the New Age philosophy around here thinks. I reflected a moment. What if God himself appeared to you and told you that was the wrong answer, and that you were supposed to guess again? What would you say? I never thought about it being the wrong answer. It makes too much sense, he replied confidently. But just suppose it was wrong. Is there anything else that you would guess? What else could it be, he asked. In the beginning there was only God, and he created the universe out of himself. That means you are made out of God and you are a part of God. If you are one with the God consciousness, then you are God just as much as Jesus was. After all, he even said in the book of John that we're supposed to be one with God just as he was. You're right, John did say that, I said. Yes, of all the writers of the Scriptures, I think John was the greatest. I'll tell John that the next time I see him, I quipped. Funny, Lance said, not suspecting the truth behind my humor. What did you call for, anyway? To ask you a question, but you already answered it. That's the way it happens when you're in tune with the universe, buddy, he said, sounding very pleased with himself. We spent a few more moments talking about family, friends, and business ideas before we said our goodbyes. He ended it with his favorite phrase, "Have a powerful day." I related the conversation to Elizabeth. This sounds like the first insight, said Elizabeth. What do you mean the first insight, I asked. I thought you read the Celestine Prophecy. This book talks about insights that will transform humanity. The first one says that we are to pay attention to coincidences, that they will lead us to paths we are to follow. Yes, I remember reading that now. It's a pretty fantastic coincidence that both Wayne and Lance had the same answer. It's especially interesting that Lance answered my question even before I asked it. Do you think that's some kind of sign? Well, it sounds like it could be. Let's suppose it is a sign, then. That means we're supposed to think in the direction of us being gods. If I tell John the answer is that I am a god or God, could that be enough, or are we supposed to think deeper? Who knows, Elizabeth shrugged. The question I have is that if I am a god, why can't I snap my fingers and just make myself well? Good question. But from what I've read about it in New Age books, the reason is that we're basically gods who have forgotten that we are gods. Because we have all power as gods, and we believe we are frail humans, this belief makes us frail humans. When we drop this false belief, then the God within us will be revealed. So all I have to do is drop my false belief and I can have power to heal myself? That's the basic teaching of the present-day gurus. That sounds too simple, she said. It does, I agreed. But simple things are often the truest. That evening when I went to bed, I felt very restless. I felt a vacuum ever since I learned that John was out of town. But as I lay on my bed that night, I felt even more depleted of energy. I felt as if I was fading in and out of reality. Finally, I fell asleep and had an unusual dream. Now, in my experience, some dreams are just dreams. But every now and then, one comes along that seems very real, and you think there must be a reality behind it. This was one of those dreams. I found myself in a room surrounded by these floating, evil-looking entities. Their faces were contorted and snarling at me as if they wanted to do me harm. I looked for a way of escape and found a door. I ran through the door and found a saintly-looking man in a rocking chair looking at me with a benevolent look on his face. I turned around and noticed that the evil spirits did not follow me into the room, and it seemed that the kindly man was somehow protecting me from them. I walked toward the man and asked, "Who are you?" He looked back at me, and I heard an authoritative voice projected toward me which said, "This is my beloved Apostle John." I looked at the benevolent-looking man with a start. He looked nothing like my bell-ringer friend, who I thought was Apostle John. This man had long sandy hair, a beard, and a fairly heavy build. John was fairly thin, no beard, black hair with touches of white. John's complexion was also darker than this man. This person in front of me was definitely a different person than the bell-ringer I knew as John. Now this voice I was hearing, which sounded very authoritative, was telling me that this other man was John the Beloved. This voice sounded like James Earl Jones when he says, "This is CNN," like you would imagine the voice of God to be. Because of the general situation, the strong impression came to my mind it must be the voice of God or Christ himself. I ventured forth a question. "Who is the other John, the bell-ringer?" The authoritative voice answered back, "The impostor you met has been an enemy from the beginning. He is a prince of evil and deceit who will lead all who believe in him into the abyss and destruction. Beware of evil that has the appearance of good. Beware of all those who teach that men are gods. I alone am God." His voice echoed until I woke up from the dream with a start and lay in my bed in contemplation. John did indeed seem sincere, and he appeared to be a true teacher, but it never occurred to me to think he was some kind of evil incarnate. Now this voice that seemed to be the voice of God showed me that what may be the true John the Beloved and the one who I thought was a true apostle may not be an apostle at all, but some kind of evil incarnate sent to lead me to, what? The voice said, the abyss and destruction? That must be some type of hell, I thought. It seemed to me that if this voice was correct, I would be destroyed. If John the bell-ringer was right, I would go on to learn the keys of knowledge. I didn't like my choice. If John the bell-ringer was wrong, I may suffer some type of eternal punishment or destruction. But if the dream was wrong, I could go on and learn the keys of knowledge from John. As this thought crossed my mind, I found it interesting that I had fear of the voice of God in the dream. I feared it was right, but I did not want it to be right. I remembered the feelings of love I had when John the bell-ringer was in my presence, especially when he sent me his memories and later taught my wife. Then I thought of how I felt when I saw the supposed John the Beloved in the dream. The evil spirits in the dream did not follow me into the room where John was, and it seemed peaceful when I entered into the presence of John in the dream. But that peace was different from the peace I felt in the presence of the bell-ringer. In that John's presence I felt a peace that penetrated me to the core, perhaps the peace that passes all understanding. But in the presence of John in the dream, the peace was like the peace you have when a baby stops crying. It seems peaceful because of a lack of disturbance, not because of any inner feeling. Next I contemplated the voice of Jesus, or God, I thought I heard in the dream. The feeling from the voice seemed to penetrate my outer body and tried to work its way into my heart, but the sound of the bells I heard from John seemed to penetrate my deepest heart center or soul and radiated to permeate my whole being. I again contemplated the two Johns, and concluded the major difference between them is that one created a feeling of fear and dread in me, and the other a feeling of love and peace. I thought long and hard within myself, as I had a feeling that I was supposed to make a choice of some kind. After a period of absolute stillness, I thought within myself, if I have to choose, I will choose the John whose bells, thoughts, and words touched my very soul. Immediately, as instantly as one can imagine, I sensed a presence by my bed. It was a presence of tremendous evil, of that I was sure. The vibration was so terrible and overwhelming that I felt like running, but somehow I knew within myself, as if I had been sent some type of revelation directly to my brain, that this powerful entity was from the abyss, was the one who had given me the dream, and was the one who was the owner of the authoritative voice. I somehow knew that he did not know that I knew he was there. He seemed to be standing by my bedside, waiting to see if I would fall for the illusion he had created for me in the dream. I knew the truth was now revealed to me because I chose John the bell ringer, that was indeed John the beloved apostle of Jesus. My choice was true. If I had chosen the other John, I would have chosen an agent of the dark side. I lay completely still for another few moments, holding my breath. I sensed the being was watching me, waiting for a response. I felt a fear beyond anything I had felt before. I somehow feared that this being had power to destroy me if I did not please him. I spent several more minutes quieting the fear and told myself I would put myself in the hands of the true God, whoever and whatever that would be. Somehow I felt I must confront this personage who was waiting for a response. "O God," I prayed within myself with sincerity that I had never had before, "what shall I do?" Immediately I felt another presence. It seemed very familiar. Somehow I knew it was the presence of the real John, the real beloved. "O John, are you there?" I asked silently. "What shall I do?" An inner voice that I knew without a doubt came from John said these words, "Laugh at him." I almost broke my silence with astonishment at that answer. It was totally unexpected. Here was perhaps the devil himself at my bedside, the most terrifying creature one can imagine, and I'm supposed to laugh at him. I had to take a few more moments to absorb that one. Finally, I asked silently again, "Are you sure I'm supposed to laugh at this thing?" No answer. Then I thought within myself, "Hey, what gives here? I want some reassurance. He might take me to some fire and brimstone if I laugh at him. Give me a sign that this is the correct thing to do, that I will be safe." There was nothing, no answer. "John," I shouted with a silent scream, "I need to know that I did not imagine that I heard you. Please give me reassurance, just this one time." Still nothing. For some reason I thought I must go with what I had received. I reflected on the voice of John. It seemed very real, more real than anything I've ever felt. My mind just had a hard time accepting it. I had to go with that which was most real to my soul, I thought, and decided to obey and laugh at the intruder who I sensed was getting very impatient. I took a moment and gathered my courage and lifted myself up in the bed and looked in the direction of the presence. I thought of Stephen Wright, my favorite comic. Then I let out a laugh as if I'd just heard a good new joke, and I said out loud, "Great try, you son of a bitch, but your little trick didn't work. I do find it very funny, though," and then I laughed some more. My laughter was stopped in its tracks by a negative force more powerful than anything I'd ever felt. It was like a whirlwind of negative energy that made me think of the Tasmanian devil and Bugs Bunny, except that I was terrified rather than entertained. I feared this thing was going to destroy my body and soul within the next 2 seconds. Suddenly, with swiftness faster than light, the entire presence left the room, and a fire came down from some heavenly sphere and completely engulfed everything that was me. I was both on fire and feeling the peace that passes all understanding, all at one moment. I knew that only God could produce such feeling. The feelings I had in the dream did not compare within a millionth of a degree to that of the fire and the peace that surrounded me at that moment. As I was enjoying this great bliss, Elizabeth turned at me sleepily. "Did I hear you laugh?" I laughed again, and with joy that I could not hold back. "Yes, my sweet, you did hear me laugh. I feel too great not to laugh." "Well, could you laugh more quietly?" she asked, somewhat irritated, and rolled over to go back to sleep. "Okay," I smiled. "I will laugh more quietly." Then I laughed what I have since called a quiet, heavenly laugh as I drifted into the most peaceful sleep I had ever experienced in my life. Chapter 11. Reunion. It was a long wait until next Thursday. I had a million questions to ask John, but the most important thing to me was just to see him again. I wanted to share my dream with him, even though I assumed he knew the story. Now the problem was that I wasn't sure how to contact him. Just before noon on Thursday, I went to Albertsons to see if he was working there again. I was disappointed to find the same substitute there again. Of course, the substitute did not know anything about when John was going to come back. I went back home and had lunch with Elizabeth and shared my frustration with her. "Are you sure you heard John right? That you would see him in a week?" "I'm sure," I said, "but who knows what all things a 2,000-year-old man must attend to. Maybe he had to go to Bosnia or something." "Even so, if he is a man of his word, he should contact you today, shouldn't he?" "You would think so. Who knows? Maybe I'm not good student material and he gave up on me." "I don't think so," Elizabeth assured me. "From that dream you told me about, it sounded like you passed some type of test." "Maybe so," I said. "I suppose I'd better get back to work, though. I have to go show a house." After showing my client the house, I drove back to Albertsons and several other bell-ringer locations. I looked everywhere I could think of, just on the off chance that John was somewhere in the area. Finally, when my workday was done, I headed home with the thought that contact was John's responsibility. If it happens, I thought. Elizabeth and I spent a quiet evening together. Finally, she broke the ice. "Have you done any more thinking about the first key?" "I've done a lot of thinking, but I don't think I can go much further until John tells me about the man-God idea." "What if he says we're not gods? You've covered about everything else. What's left?" "I don't know. Maybe we're just animals," I said sarcastically. "You may be just joking," said Elizabeth, "but I guess we have to be open to everything." "I guess," I agreed. We went to bed just before 11, which was quite early for me, and I lay on the bed trying to drift off to sleep, disappointed that I had not seen or heard anything from John. Then as I drifted off to sleep, I heard bells. Bells. I woke suddenly. "I heard bells," I exclaimed to Elizabeth. She woke up. "Bells? It must be John." "Yes, it must be John, but now I'm awake. I can't hear them." "You always hear them when you're close to sleep. Try to go back to sleep." "You're right. I'll try that," I said. I tried to go back to sleep, but sleep had fled from me. After a moment I said, "I couldn't sleep right now if my life depended on it." Elizabeth sighed. "Why don't you just try laying still and tuning in? Maybe John will send you something." "I'll try," I said. I lay still and tried to tune into my inner self. At first nothing happened, and then faintly I heard the bells again. I somehow knew I was supposed to focus on the sound, and did so. As I focused, the sound became clearer, and an image of John formed within my mind. I saw him drinking a cup of coffee at Denny's, at the exact same seat where we talked before. Somehow I knew he was there waiting for me. "He's at Denny's," I exclaimed, as I rose up out of bed and headed for my clothes. "Denny's?" Elizabeth asked sleepily. "Denny's," I said firmly. "I'm going there now. I may be a while, so don't worry about me." Elizabeth turned to me and asked, "Sweetheart." "Yes?" "Tell John thank you for giving me faith again. Even though I've lost that extra strength, I now have hope that I can be healed." "I'll tell him," I said. In a few moments I was in my car approaching Denny's. I found myself wondering if there was something special about Denny's or if it was just a convenient place. Oh, well, that question was far down on the list. As I walked into the restaurant, I noticed the time on the wall clock was about 1 minute to midnight. I hurriedly walked to the corner where we met before, and there he was drinking coffee looking exactly like I saw in my mind a few moments before. "John," I said, reaching out my hand. "I've never been so glad to see anyone before." John smiled as I sat down. "Not every beginning student feels that way," he said. "Are you sure I'm not the prince of evil and deceit bent on leading you to some eternal hell?" "You know about the dream, then?" "Yes. It was not unexpected. He pulls a similar trick on every student I have that shows promise." "He? Who is he?" "Who do you think?" "Well, I do know this. Whoever he was capable of disguising himself as an agent of God. Yet when I sensed his true nature, it was an evil vibration beyond anything I have imagined. If there is a devil, well, this has to be him." John smiled. "In the days of Jesus, we didn't use the silly-sounding word devil. We called him the adversary. The word Satan in the Hebrew means adversary. Today we would call someone like Hitler, Saddam Hussein, or a terrorist an adversary or enemy. But it would sound silly to call them devils. We didn't use boogeyman-like words, fluffy words, or fairy tale-like words back then. We were dealing with real energies, real beings, and real situations. The religious authority of the day were the ones who feared the illusionary boogeyman." I nodded. I could certainly tell that being was an adversary. I knew he wanted to destroy me when he learned I saw his real self. "He still wants to destroy you," said John. "You really made him mad when you laughed at him." John laughed. "You told me to do it," I exclaimed. "I didn't realize I was just making him mad. Well, that's all I need, an enemy of immense power from the underworld." I frowned. John paused a moment and studied my face. "As long as you side with light and truth, he will be your mortal enemy with all the force he has available." Then grinning, he said, "I figure you might as well get a dig in when you can." "That doesn't sound like turning the other cheek," I countered. "As Solomon said, there's a time and a place for everything. Through his control of agents here on the earth, he has had me killed and tortured about 20 times. The last time I was hung up by piano wire, and the first time I was boiled in oil. That alone should be enough to deserve the reward of laughing at his defeat. You'll never realize the joy you gave me when you followed my instructions." "I think we really pissed him off all right," I laughed nervously. "That's an unpious term," John scolded, but I couldn't express it better. I took a sip of coffee. "It still makes me nervous. He might try to take it out on me, as if I didn't have enough problems in my life. From the moment you saw through the illusion and passed the test, you became a mortal enemy. But don't worry, he cannot harm you if you follow the light of truth and the Holy Spirit within you. At present, you are following the highest you know, and you are completely protected. But there are energy points in time and space, like acupuncture points in the body. When one of those points is arrived at, it provides an opportunity for both good and evil. For instance, the other night you had a visit from a strong evil force, and also a powerful good force. The fire you felt was what we used to call the baptism of fire. If you go forward, you must risk the chance of going backwards." "Well, what would have happened if I had fallen for the illusion?" "I would have kept my word and seen you today, but because you would not have had the spiritual fire, you would have rejected me and the knowledge that I have for you." "Would I have been some servant of evil then?" I asked. "Not in the sense you are thinking," John replied. "That would only happen if you have a very selfish intent within your heart. What he seeks to do with basically good people is to neutralize them. After they are neutralized, he generally leaves them alone and goes on to other work. Only if a person sinks into great illusion and selfishness can he then be of conscious use to the Dark Brothers." "Who is this adversary, and who are the Dark Brothers?" I asked. "They're just like you and me," John replied. "They are brothers of ours, but very wayward brothers. As you know, there must be opposition in all things. If there is an appearance of a positive force, then that appearance can only be held if there exists the appearance of a negative force." "Why do you use the term appearance?" "Because positive and negative are real to you in this world. But in the higher reality there is only one energy, and that is God. It is important for teaching's sake that we always deal with the reality we are in. If you try to solve the riddles of the higher reality before you understand your own, you can get caught up in illusion that will cause you to wind up far behind the simple realist." I nodded. "I do notice that many intelligent dreamers do not seem to accomplish anything, whereas a dull-witted plodder often achieves a surprising amount." "Your statement deserves to be reflected upon," he said. "I must have hit upon something important in my progression," I reflected. "So are these Dark Brothers burning in hell like the preachers tell us?" "They live in a world with no glory, but the illusion of glory. To understand what that means, you must solve a future key." He shifted in his seat and clasped his hands. "Let me put it this way. All of us have a spark of divinity within us. As you follow this spark, your glory, light, truth, and power of love is increased. There are certain very selfish individuals, through conscious effort, shut themselves completely off from soul contact. After this, they completely deny all things that are good and true. Because they are conscious beings with no true spiritual contact, their consciousness creates a world that is complete illusion, with no real light or glory. They believe that the true spiritual plane created by God is illusion, and that they have discovered or created the only true reality. Because this false belief is so real, there is no escape, and all that makes them individuals is in a state of death or disintegration. This drawn-out death often takes many years, but after it happens, the spark that is their true self will continue, and the person will be recreated in a future opportunity on an earth that does not even exist yet. That's pretty heavy doctrine, I replied. Does that mean there is no burning in hell? There is in a sense, he replied. When one has rejected light, surrounds himself with illusion, and then comes in contact with real light, it produces a spiritual pain, something like a fire. Why do you think the adversary fled so quickly when the Spirit descended on you the other night? The light and fire of the Spirit was painful to him beyond anything you can imagine. Even though he wanted more than anything to destroy you, he was forced to leave instantly. It was the most sudden exit I've ever seen, I nodded. John continued. When people die and go to the next world, they reside with others who have a similar light to their own. Many are disappointed when they realize how little light they have followed on this earth, and then desire to go higher. This desire takes them near the presence of a greater light and is very painful to them. They want to move toward the light, but the approach is painful like a fire. So they are in hell in two different ways. They have to live with others who are of a lesser light and not very pleasant company, and secondly, a desire to escape leads them to a fiery pain. Are they stuck in the situation forever? No. A way is made for their progress, but we could spend days on this subject. Let us move on. John nodded to a waitress passing by for more coffee. I have one more question first, I pursued after she left. Go ahead. Where have you been? I didn't expect you to disappear like you did. John frowned. Actually, I didn't either, but my master needed me. And that would be? Well, who do you think? Jesus? I asked in wonderment. Jesus is a modern pronunciation of the name he went by 2,000 years ago in Palestine. Of course, the preachers of this age have become attached to it, but those within his inner circle just call him the Christ when making reference to him. When I get the opportunity to speak to him on a personality level, as I am with you, I just call him Joshua. The original pronunciation of the name Jesus was something like Jesus, but the name is pretty close to obsolete now. He decided a couple hundred years ago to use Joshua, the English translation of the Hebrew equivalent of Jesus, because it is still a name in common use. Joshua Christ, I smiled. That will take some getting used to. He wouldn't think of using the name Jesus except for purposes of identification, John said. Every time he hears one of the preachers speak or shout the name out in that religious twang, he cringes. You know, I've always wondered what Jesus thought about how preachers massacre his name. John reflected for a moment. There are many mysteries to be revealed, which are associated with Jesus, as you call him, and the Christ. I know him by two of his names, and he has a third which only he knows. What's the other name that you know? I couldn't tell you that without his permission, he replied softly. What's the purpose of having more than one name, I asked. I cannot tell you at the present. That knowledge is contained in one of the keys you will learn in the future. I can tell you a little about the term the Christ. It's not part of his name, but is the name of an office. The most enlightened teacher associated with mankind on the planet has this office and is called the Christ. Joshua will not always hold this office. In about another 1,000 years, he will leave this solar system, and the position of the Christ will be taken over by a close disciple. The title Christ, without the article the, is used by many disciples who share what has been called the Christ consciousness. I am one who is free to use the name Christ for myself as long as the one being communicated to does not mistake me for the master teacher. Those who bear the name of Christ are not permitted to knowingly deceive, and the wrong use of the title could produce deception. Self-deception, however, will often occur because of wrong interpretation of doctrine transmitted by teachers. So why were you called away so suddenly, I probed. There was an emergency. John looked serious. Can you tell me anything about it? Not a lot. I can tell you that a situation developed where some terrorists had an opportunity to obtain nuclear weapons that would have been planted in Washington, D.C. This event was not in the plan and had to be prevented. What did you do to prevent it, I asked. Even if I could tell you, I do not have time to go into it. Joshua needed my assistance, and fortunately I was there to help. It was at great sacrifice that I was able to make this appointment with you. There are still some details I have to return to attend to. Is saving the world from nuclear attack something you do often? I quipped. The last time we had a crisis like this was back in the early 80s, when the scientists were working on a neutron bomb. Its perfection would have been too great of a temptation for any nation at this time, and this weapon and several others had to be contained. So do you control men's minds to avoid catastrophes, I ask? The disciples of Christ, or the Brotherhood of Light, never force men's minds. We are obligated to honor free will. The Dark Brothers, on the other hand, will use force whenever they feel the need and have the opportunity. They often find that all they have to do is create a little illusion to have their way with the masses. John paused a moment. You've done a good job of sidetracking me, but we need to get on with your education. Do you at least remember the question I posed to you last week? I think I got that anyway. It is, who or what am I? I'm pleased you remember the exact wording you said. Now can you give me an answer? Well, I said nervously, with a little help from my friends and the Gospel of John, which I assume you wrote, I concluded that men are gods. So you are God with a capital G or a God with a small g? I stumbled for a moment. Well, the Mormons say we're becoming a God with a small g, and the New Agers say we're a God with a big G. And what do you say? Well, I stumbled again, clearing my throat. If I am one with God, I must be God with a big G. It sounds weird to say that, but I guess that's my answer. Are you confident in that answer? Sort of. What makes you sort of confident? I've had several coincidences pointing me in that direction. I figure they must have happened for a reason. So he had some signs leading you toward the answer, John smiled. I guess you could say that, I replied. Have you read what the Master said about signs? John asked. I think he said several things, didn't he? John got out his old Bible again and turned to Matthew chapter 16. Read verse 4, he said, pushing the book toward me. I carefully held the old book and read, A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. I just about dropped the book. I remember reading this scripture, but never thought about it in the context that is now entering my head. I thought the answer may be that I am God because of signs, but Jesus said the wicked seek for signs. You are not actively seeking a sign, John assured me, but several appeared to you and you thought they meant something. So are you telling me they didn't mean anything, I asked, somewhat disappointed. It's true that there's a reason or cause behind each happening, John replied. But when people see coincidences, they often read much more into them than should be. Suppose you roll the dice hundreds of times. Sooner or later you will roll 7 3 times in a row. Does that have any deep meaning, or did it just happen because you rolled the dice many times and the law of averages tell us you will eventually roll 3 7s? So are you saying that coincidences just happen now and then? Generally that is the case, he said. But then every once in a while coincidences are contrived by higher power. But what usually happens when a coincidence happens to a superstitious person, much more will be read into it than is based in reality. So the fact that both Wayne, Lance, and the Dark Brothers mention man and gods is just a coincidence and means nothing? Not entirely, John replied. You, Wayne, and Lance have been friends for many years, and as such tune into each other's frequency and share many of the same thoughts. This greatly increases the chances that you will all come up with similar conclusions on various ideas. What happened with you three was not nearly as much of a coincidence as you thought. You were looking for an answer, and you were happy that something finally seemed to jump out at you. It was no coincidence, however, that the Dark Brother jumped on this. It served his purpose. So what about the answer, then, I asked? Is it all right or wrong? Let's regress just a moment, John said, putting his fingers together. Why do you suppose Joshua said a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign? Now, in reality, wicked means misled. So how is one misdirected who seeks for a sign? I've never thought of looking for a sign in a negative light, I said. Most people see signs as a positive thing. John was silent, evidently waiting for a concise answer. I continued. Okay, let me see. If we use a sign to guide our lives, then we're using something outside of ourselves. Perhaps we're supposed to be looking within. John smiled. There's hope for you yet. I think your light is increasing. Now what is adulterous about seeking a sign for guidance? That's a tough one. I don't see a lot of relation there. There's a lot of correspondence here, said John. Answer me this. What is adultery? Well, it's where a person betrays his marriage partner and has a sexual relationship with someone else, I replied. And who is your spiritual marriage partner supposed to be? You mean someone other than my physical wife, I asked. Yes. Could it be God? You are correct. This is taught throughout the Scriptures. The Israelites are called the bride of Jehovah throughout the Old Testament, and the church is called the bride of Christ in the New. Both Israel and the church are symbols of those who have the light of the Spirit of God within them. So how does a bride of Christ or God commit adultery? Perhaps by leaving or leaning on or uniting with someone else other than God? Very close, said John. The brother of light senses the Spirit of God within himself and has made a commitment to follow it and be one with it, similar to the marriage relationship. If he actively seeks a sign outside of himself as his main source of guidance, this causes a shift of attention away from the Spirit. So his God becomes a false God outside of himself, and the inner God is ignored and betrayed. He has committed adultery against the one true source of guidance, which places a black wall between the personality self and the God within. Fascinating, I said, feeling like Spock again. So the New Agers, who are always teaching about the God within, yet at the same time are always seeking coincidences and signs, are really teaching one thing and doing another. They're not alone, John smiled. On the other side of the spectrum, the very religious also seek for signs rather than an answer from God through prayer as they claim to teach. So are we to look within for all answers, I ask? Not exactly. That would mean the outside world has no meaning or purpose. The purpose of the outside world is to stimulate with experience. The purpose of the inner is to verify. Without the outer, there is nothing to verify. Without the inner, there is no source to find the point of truth that exists in all things. It would appear to me, then, the religious fundamentalists look without for their answers, and the New Agers try to look within, but both are concentrating too much on one side of the pendulum, I said. Another good answer, John said, smiling. Now you're going to want me to tell you if you have the right answer. I've been very curious all week. I leaned forward eagerly. Let's have another cup of coffee and we'll explore your thoughts, he said. Chapter 12. Gods are us. John took a sip of fresh coffee and said, Now tell me your answer. I figure this has to be a good answer because it is a direct quote from Jesus, or Joshua as you call him, and it was written by you in the book of John chapter 10. There Jesus said, Ye are gods. John smiled back at me and said, So what is the answer to the question, who or what are you? I guess men are gods, I said tepidly. I keep telling you to listen to the precise words I say. The question is, who or what are you, not what are humans. Now think over the question and answer again. Well, I guess I am God, or a God, I said. Which one is it? Are you God or a God? I didn't think the answer would be that awkward. I tried again. The Mormons say a God, and the New Agers say just God. And what do you say? He said. I guess I am God, I said, feeling a little strange. Should I worship you then? John grinned. No, of course not, I exclaimed. Then are you sure you are God? I'm not sure, I replied weakly. Maybe I'm just a God. So you are a God then? John smiled again with that look in his eye that revealed he knew things that were beyond my grasp. Then you must have great power. Why don't you levitate that waitress over there and show me your power? Better still, why don't you snap your fingers and heal your wife? His latter words reached the core of my being. There was nothing that revealed my powerlessness more than the fact that I'd been unable to help my own wife. What a fool I am, I thought to myself. If I am God or a God, then I should be able to heal my wife. I cast my eyes to the floor with great emotion. I felt like I was nobody, let alone a God. John looked in my eyes with compassion. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I just wanted to get your attention. You got it all right, I said. Boy, do I feel like a fool. I'm no more a God than that ashtray over there. If I was God's little toe, I could have healed Elizabeth. I seem to do nothing for her, and I feel like nothing. I felt more emotional than I had in years. Don't let emotion take your eyes away from the truth, John said softly. A true seeker must be part Spock, part Captain Kirk with a dash of Bones. I started to laugh. Glad I cheered you up. What's funny? I just had an image of John the Revelator watching Star Trek. It just struck me as very humorous, comparable to Jesus singing a rap song. It's funny how you can sometimes switch from one emotion to another when something strikes you right. John looked a little perplexed for the first time since I had met him. I'll have to ask Joshua if he's done any rap lately, he quipped. Now getting back to the subject, you must be part Spock and part Captain Kirk here to find the truth. Emotion always turns the truth upside down. So was my answer about being God right or wrong? It was not the correct answer, he said. So we are not really gods, then? John paused and said, Was your answer about being human the correct answer? You said no. But you are human. Yes, so are you saying my answer may be true, but the wrong answer? Exactly. We are called human beings, but since a human doesn't know who he is, then naming yourself human doesn't really bring you any knowledge about yourself, does it? I guess not. If I say that you are God, and you do not know what or who God is, then that does not bring you an increase in knowledge, does it? No, I answered. You don't really know any more about who you are than you did before I told you that you are God. I think I see what you're getting at. You're saying I must answer the question with something that really tells me about who I am. If I say I am flesh and don't know the difference between flesh and silicone, then I might as well say I am silicone. My answer means nothing if I don't know what flesh is. That is good, my friend, he said. I may use your example with my next student. Yes, your answer must mean something. Saying that you are human, God, or a son of God may all be true. But if you cannot explain what the terms mean, then they are just labels without meaning and true knowledge. Frustrated that I still didn't know the answer, I stated, Before we go on, I would like you to explain the scripture in John chapter 10. There's a big dispute among Bible believers as to whether Jesus was really telling us whether or not we were gods. What conclusion did you come to, he asked. Sounds like Jesus is really telling us that we are gods. You are correct. I was actually in his presence several times when he used this argument. After he obtained a certain amount of notoriety in Jerusalem, he was often approached by religious authorities who had heard their followers express the belief that he was either the Messiah, a god, son of God, or an ancient prophet brought back from the dead or reborn. They would often speak to him with venom, saying something like, Who do you think you are, the Son of God? Then he would answer something like this, What if I did say I am a son of God? Why do you think that is a big deal when your own law of God in the Psalms and the writings of Moses calls you gods? If those who merely receive the Scriptures are called gods, why do you think it would be a major claim for me to say that I am a son of God? Here, let's turn to the Psalms. John opened his old Bible to the Psalms. The first verse of the chapter in question reads, God standeth in the congregation of the mighty, he judges among the gods. Who are the gods that he judges among? It tells us in verse 6, which reads, I have said ye are gods, and all of you children of the Most High. Here we are told that the gods that God judges among are the ones who receive the Scriptures, as Jesus said. In fact, there are numerous instances in the writings of Moses where people who judged among the people were called gods. In the Bibles today, these are usually translated incorrectly. But if you use any Hebrew concordance from a regular Christian bookstore, you can prove to yourself that the judges were really called gods from time to time. I'll write down these references so you can look them up. John scribbled down some references and handed them to me. It read Exodus 21:6 and Exodus 22:8-9. Now everywhere the word judges is mentioned in these scriptures, it comes from the Hebrew Elohim, which is the same word used for the God who created heaven and earth. Interestingly, they translated it correctly in the King James Version in Exodus 22, verse 28. He handed it to me and it read, Thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of the people. John offered an interpretation. The ruler of the people was Moses, and the gods were Moses and the judges. This is why David in the Psalms called God as one who judges among the gods. I added, Fundamentalist Christians think that Psalms 82:7 refutes the idea that men are gods. Here, I'll read it. But ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. Because this comes right after the ye are gods statement, they say that ye are gods is a mockery. What does it sound like to you? It sounds to me David was saying they were gods who were behaving like they were just men. That is correct, said John. Now turn to Exodus chapter 4, verse 16 and read. I read, And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. John explained, here it is talking about the calling of Aaron to be a spokesman for Moses. However, the translation is poor concerning Moses. The Hebrew reads, Thou shalt be a God to him, to Aaron. I can see why your life is in danger from time to time, I remarked. I bet you really make some religious people nervous when you talk the scriptures. John smiled. Unrealized truth, clearly presented, can cause a great disturbance. The master at that was Joshua, or Jesus. The Bible does not do justice at relating how angry he made the religious authorities of his time. I can imagine, I nodded. So from our conversation so far, it sounds as if you're telling me that we are gods, just as the scriptures say, but just accepting that does not really tell us who we are. So it is not the answer to your question. That is correct. You are both God, and from another perspective, you are becoming a god, but none of these statements mean more than just words to those who quote them. I will give you a hint that will help you realize more of what God is. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and tell me next week what you come up with. Here, I'll write that down next to the other references. I notice you quote a lot from the Bible, I remarked while he wrote. What do you think of the other scriptures and philosophies of the world? I use the Bible often with you because it carries so much weight in this part of the world. There is some truth in all the scriptures and all the philosophies of the world. I am familiar with many of them and have taught from many of them. Now getting back to the subject, do you have any other ideas about who or what you are before I give you the next hint? I thought a moment. So basically all my answers are correct, but they just don't mean anything. I'm human, I'm spirit, I'm soul, I'm a son of God, and I'm even a god or maybe even God in some esoteric way, but none of these statements communicate more than a vague idea. Is that correct? That is exactly correct. Can you think of an answer to the question that does mean something to you? I don't know if I can give you anything intelligent right now. Why don't you give me my next hint and I'll think about it during the next week? All right, my friend, here it is. To better understand who or what you are, it is helpful to know what you are not. I think you've already concluded that you are not your body, that the body is merely a vehicle for that which is the real you. Yes, I've pretty much accepted that. Just like you have a car which is a vehicle that takes you places with the real you inside the car. So do you have a body which is not the real you, which is a vehicle that takes you places. The real you directs the vehicle. What many do not realize is that the real you has other vehicles besides your physical body. There are two other things you are not. You are not your emotions and you are not your mind. Instead, these are two other vehicles you use to take you places. The question remains, if you are not your body, your emotions, or your mind, what remains? Who or what are you? That's interesting, I mused. Many lay philosophers like myself are aware that we are not our bodies, but most see our feelings and thoughts as part of our eternal nature. But you say they are not part of our real selves either, but just vehicles? That is correct, John replied. Contemplate this and the scriptures I gave you, and we'll meet back here at Denny's next week at midnight. Are you going back to your bell-ringing job, I asked. I may have to skip it for the rest of the season, he said. Joshua needs my help to place some safeguards on some terrorism that has potential to hinder the purpose of God on the earth. Whatever you see happening the next few years, I want you to know that it could have been a lot worse without our intervention. Hopefully we can get things taken care of the next few weeks. Don't ask me any questions about it. There's little I can reveal to you at the present. Sounds like you're a spiritual James Bond, I said, smiling. John returned a light smile. Elizabeth told me to tell you she appreciates the fact that you gave her hope. How's she doing? He asked. She had her strength back for a short time, but now she is like she was before, or perhaps worse. Ask her this for me, said John. Ask her if she has discovered her fears and thoughts she has been hiding from herself, and has she learned to put them in the right place? I'll ask her, I said. John arose as if he were ready to go. He pulled a red handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to me. Tell her to rub this on her forehead 3 times a day. It will give her additional strength and make life more bearable for her for the next week. However, you must return it to me when we meet again. I'll do it, I nodded, taking the handkerchief from his hand. Do you have to go now? I'm afraid so. We paid and walked out the door. As we were walking down the street, he said, Your car is in the other direction. I know, but I'm curious. Where are you going, and how are you going to get there? I'm going to the Middle East, he said. The exact point I will not say. How, you may ask? Let us go behind that tree and I will show you. I walked with him behind a tree where we were out of sight from passers-by. He stood perfectly still, closed his eyes, bowed his head slightly, and whispered a word ever so softly. In an instant he was gone. He didn't fade away like some ghost in the movies. He was just instantly gone. I wasn't sure which word he uttered. He said it so softly, but it seemed like it was Joshua. Note: this was written in 1997, sometime before the terrorist attack of 9/11. Chapter 13. Hidden Fears. On my way home I found myself thinking there was now no way I could doubt that John was a mystical being. I was already very convinced of his reality because of the power of his teachings and the internal spiritual feelings he generated. But when you see someone just disappear before your eyes like that, it brings home a realization of a higher reality that is just undeniable. After I arrived home, I tried getting into bed without disturbing Elizabeth, but without success. Honey, it's after 3, she said. I was worried that you and John ran off together. Not a chance. You're lucky he had to go. I could have talked to him for days without sleeping. I hope you've gotten some sleep since I've left. She was silent. That meant she never slept. I wish you'd listen to me about your rest, I said. You've been awake all this time, haven't you? How do you expect me to sleep when you're out there having high spiritual drama, she said. I've got to admit, I couldn't have slept either. So did you have the right answer? Are we gods or what? She asked. I rehearsed to her the dialogue that occurred between John and I. Let me get this right, she said. Everything everyone thinks we are is not what we really are because they are just phrases that don't tell us anything. We're also not our bodies, feelings, or thoughts. There doesn't seem to be much left for us to be. Maybe we're just blobs of nothing. That feels about as good of an answer as any that I feel right now, I said, somewhat frustrated. Let me try out that handkerchief, she said. I retrieved it and handed it to her. He said rub it on your forehead and it would give you strength. I know it sounds crazy, but after what I've experienced with John so far, I'm willing to try anything. She took it and placed it on her forehead. Then she rubbed it back and forth with her hands seemingly growing steadier. Finally a smile graced her face as if she were experiencing pleasure. She looked at me and said, Sweetheart, make love to me. I do believe I was more surprised at this request than John's disappearance. She hadn't shown any interest in lovemaking for some time because of her illness. Are you sure? I asked. Very sure, she said with a very sensual voice. We made love immediately with more feelings of pleasure and sensuality, and on the other extreme, more spiritual feelings than I ever felt in lovemaking. The only way I could describe the feeling was a union that belonged to the gods and not humankind. Afterwards, we were lying together in silence, contemplating the experience. If I never get better, Elizabeth said softly, this moment is worth a lifetime. How many live a whole lifetime in good health and never have one moment as we've just had? Very well said, but of course no one else is married to you, I said. We embraced and fell asleep in each other's arms. We both arose the next morning after just a couple hours' sleep, but we both felt refreshed. Elizabeth seemed to have her strength back again and insisted she make breakfast. After we sat down together, she asked, So have you done any thinking about who or what we are? A little. So if we're not just a blob of nothing, what are we? She asked. I've been thinking of it this way. If my body is taken away, I may still have feelings and thoughts. If my body and emotions were taken away, then I have thoughts. But if all three were taken away, I would still be something. I've been imagining stepping aside from all my vehicles and visualizing what is there. I know and feel there is something there, the driver of the vehicles, some type of livingness. Maybe you are just life itself, she said. I know what John would say if I said that. He would ask, what is life? And the answer to that has baffled philosophers for ages, she said. Maybe we ought to start with the easy stuff, I said. John told me to ask you if you have discovered the thoughts and fears you have been hiding from yourself, and if you have learned to put them in the right place. I must be hiding them well, for I'm not sure what they would be, she said. Have you thought about them at all? What's there to think about? I think I'm pretty open to my thoughts and fears. Actually, I don't have many fears outside of becoming incapacitated with this disease. I've thought a little about it. If you are hiding certain thoughts and fears, perhaps they are especially hidden from yourself, as you said. So if you try and look for them, they are hard to find because you yourself have hidden them from yourself. So you're saying I've hidden them so well I can't find them. Maybe it's something like this, I said. Let's say you have an extra $20 and hide it in a cookie jar. For some reason you forgot about hiding it there. Then sometime later you need the 20, and it does not occur to you to look anywhere for it because you cannot even remember that it ever existed. Perhaps you haven't seriously looked for these hidden thoughts and fears because you do not believe they exist. But just as the $20 still exists in the cookie jar, whether you believe it or not, so do your thoughts and fears exist waiting to be found. You've been spending too much time with John. You're sounding just like him, she said. Thanks for the compliment, but I've known you for a long time, and I sense that you have a reluctance to find those hidden fears. If they are hidden, and I don't know they exist, then they don't have power to hurt me. Why should I go looking for trouble, she said. You may not have been looking for trouble. In fact, you probably have been trying to avoid it. Nevertheless, trouble has found you. If John is right, you must realize you have to let down the barriers and find what you have hidden. Elizabeth looked like she wanted to hit me. So if you know me so well, you tell me what I'm hiding. I don't know if I can find it for you. I think only you can recognize them when found, but maybe I can encourage you and push you in the right direction. So push me then, she said. I've drawn a blank here. I have a feeling you have some residual fears that are connected to your early religious upbringing. That's silly, she said. My religious beliefs have changed drastically over the years. Just like I no longer fear the boogeyman, I also no longer fear fire and brimstone teachings of the old-time religion. You say that, but is it possible you almost put too much emphasis on the idea that you're not afraid of burning in hell and that guilt is beyond you? I think the idea that God would send you to a burning hell is ridiculous. A loving God would not do that, she said. Well, logically, that's true. But things you were taught as a child may have a much more powerful effect than you may admit. Weren't your parents very religious, fundamentalist Baptists? Yes, I had to go to church every Sunday, no matter what. I remember you said that your dad's favorite preacher was this hellfire and damnation guy who loved to shout about the punishments of God. You said he portrayed humans as terrible sinners who are going to suffer unimaginable pain and suffering if they don't follow the Bible and the line of virtue 100%. Yeah, I cringe at the memory of that guy, Elizabeth replied. Dad made all of us sit in the front row and listen to that horrible diatribe. At the dinner table during the week, he would talk about the sermon and how it applies to all of our lives. When I got interested in boys, Dad finally hammered virtue into me. He made me feel that if I ever slipped up and had sex before marriage, I was going to burn in hell forever. I paused a moment and said evenly, And those old teachings don't bother you anymore? Elizabeth sniffed. Of course not. Like I said, I put them behind me like the boogeyman. I don't think you put them entirely behind you, I said. For one thing, I can tell the memory of those days still bothers you. Everybody has painful memories they don't like to think of, Elizabeth said, wheeling her chair out of the kitchen. I decided to change the subject for a moment. Elizabeth was getting pretty defensive. I stood in front of her. Your mother was a perfectionist, wasn't she? Didn't she put a lot of pressure on you to be the perfect child? Elizabeth lowered her eyes. When I was little, I tried to never do anything to disappoint my folks, like I never misbehaved or talked back to them. I remember even apologizing to them in little notes I wrote for not being better in some way. But when I got older and more independent and started dating, they both seemed disappointed in me. Disappointed? How? I asked. I don't know how to describe it. Like their innocent little girl, their perfect child, grew up and innocence was lost. I did feel sexual guilt, I guess. My mom gave me the 3rd degree after every date, and my dad wasn't comfortable being physically affectionate anymore. I really felt their discomfort with my sexuality. Maybe I was feeling their sexual guilt instead of my own. Elizabeth then added after a pause, it seemed like I couldn't do anything right. Did you ever feel like they didn't love you for who you really were, or that their love was conditioned on you conforming to their idea of perfection? Elizabeth's eyes moistened. Yes, she replied softly. And I never measured up, no matter how hard I tried. They never got to know me as a person, and after a while, I didn't want them to. I got a little rebellious, did my share of sowing wild oats, and I'm sure they didn't want to know about that side of me either. It would have killed them, I think. That may be it, I exclaimed, kneeling in front of Elizabeth. If your folks knew who you really were, the real you think it would have killed them. So you punish yourself by suppressing the real you, by killing the real you. Elizabeth looked a little pale. You need to get to work. We can talk about this later. Work can wait, I replied. Do you see how there might be some connection between this fear of discovery, your suppression of the truth, your guilt, and your disease today? Maybe, Elizabeth frowned. I think I've worked through my stuff pretty well, though. I'm my own person now. I don't need my parents' approval anymore. But you need your own, I said gently, taking her hand. As I got up, I said, I think we need to explore it. I'll go to work now, but I want you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll think about the guilt that you may still feel about those days, and the fear of not measuring up to your patient's standards for you. What good does it do? Elizabeth looked up at me angrily. It doesn't change anything. No, but facing your fears can change you, I said, squeezing her shoulder. Will you try, please? It may heal your disease. I'll see what I can do, she said. But I think it will do more harm than good. Trust me on this one. I think this is the right direction. I kissed her goodbye and put on my coat, hoping I was right.